Chapter 5: The Magic of Brain Metabolism. Welcome to the human brain, the cathedral of complexity. Peter Coveney and Roger Highfield, Frontiers of Complexity. The brain demands about 20% of your body's total daily energy supply, 10 times what you would expect for an organ of its size. This voracious appetite for fuel is due largely to its sodium-potassium pumps, which work diligently around the clock to force charged salt particles apart and maintain the electrical imbalance needed to prime neurons to fire. To supply your brain with energy, you need fuel, of course, but you also need micronutrients like B vitamins and iron to help operate the cellular machinery that burns that fuel. Required in minuscule amounts, micronutrients play an outsized role in cellular life. In the dizzying array of intersecting burning and building pathways that make up the miracle of brain metabolism, vitamins and minerals are there at every turn, activating enzymes, influencing genes, conducting electricity, and performing hundreds of other metabolic chores. Brain energy production begins in the gut, where your stomach, intestines, liver, and pancreas cooperate to break down the foods you eat into small molecules to fuel your brain. So rather than diving headfirst into brain metabolism, let's start with gut metabolism and work our way up to the brain so you can see how each system behaves when you are eating and when you are fasting. I've highlighted certain nutrients along the way, but in Appendix C, you'll find a complete list of essential micronutrients, along with a description of the key roles each one plays in energizing and supporting your brain. Insulin as metabolic maestro. The word metabolism refers to the symphony of chemical reactions that cells use to extract energy from food and conduct their daily business. Metabolic reactions fall into two categories: construction or anabolic pathways, involved in building, growth, and storage projects, and destruction, catabolic pathways, involved in burning, recycling, and demolition projects. These opposing forces are tightly controlled by an elegant system of enzymes, sensors, feedback loops, and hormones that determine how active these pathways should be at any given time. Hormones are chemical messengers produced by glands and released into the bloodstream in tiny amounts to influence the behavior of faraway cells. Many hormones work in concert to regulate your metabolism, but one of the most important ones, and arguably the one you have the most control over, is insulin. Deep within your abdomen, your pancreas is continuously releasing insulin into your bloodstream to support your metabolism. And the amount of insulin your pancreas produces at any given time is largely determined by your diet. All foods, and most beverages, stimulate the pancreas to produce some amount of insulin. But as a general rule, carbohydrates cause the greatest rise in insulin levels. Most proteins cause a mild to moderate rise in insulin. Fat barely stimulates insulin at all. The most powerful driver of insulin production is rising blood glucose, and the most powerful driver of rising blood glucose is dietary carbohydrate, sugars and starches. With refined carbohydrates, such as sugar, fruit juice, and processed grain products, flour, white rice, instant oats, breakfast cereals, etc., demanding the greatest amount of insulin. Remember, starch is just lots of glucose molecules linked together, so foods don't have to be sweet to raise your blood glucose. When your pancreas senses that glucose levels are rising, it releases insulin into the circulation to squirrel the extra glucose away into cells and bring blood glucose levels back down again. Insulin's ability to keep glucose in check is very important because high blood glucose is toxic and will slowly damage every cell in the body. People with diabetes inject themselves with insulin to control high blood glucose levels, so it's common to think of insulin as a simple blood glucose regulator. But the whole truth is that insulin is a master growth hormone, a chief orchestrator of anabolic metabolism. Put simply, insulin tells your cells what to do with incoming food molecules. Virtually every cell in the brain and the rest of the body wears insulin receptors on its surface so it can listen for insulin's cues. Like musicians focused on a conductor's baton, your cells constantly fine-tune their behavior in response to insulin as its blood levels rise and fall. Insulin high, burn glucose, make fat. When insulin is high and glucose is abundant, such as after a typical balanced meal that contains a decent amount of carbohydrate, your metabolism shifts into growth and storage mode. You burn glucose for energy and turn excess calories into fat. Insulin is the hormone of plenty, announcing to cells far and wide that a fresh supply of nutrients is available for growth, repair, and storage projects. In many cases, insulin even micromanages the delivery of glucose to individual cells. For example, when insulin attaches to insulin receptors on muscle and fat cells, those cells respond by opening chutes that allow glucose molecules to tumble in. Insulin then directs those cells to fire up their assembly lines so they can use incoming nutrients to build new molecules. To fuel all of this activity, insulin throws glucose into the cell's metabolic furnaces to chop it up and turn it into energy. If there's more glucose in your bloodstream than your cells can use right away, insulin instructs muscle and liver cells to knit those surplus glucose molecules together into glycogen, starch, to top off their energy reserves, a process that requires vitamin B7. Once those starch silos are full, insulin instructs the liver to turn the rest of the glucose into triglycerides, fat, and ship them out to fat cells for storage. Insulin low, burn fat, make glucose. When insulin is low and glucose is limited, such as when you are fasting or eating a ketogenic diet, your metabolism shifts into fat-burning mode and you make your own glucose. The combination of low insulin and dipping glucose triggers fat cells to break down stored fat molecules into fatty acids, which requires vitamin B5, and release them into the circulation to feed hungry cells. If your metabolism is healthy and flexible, most of your cells' activities will readily switch from burning glucose to burning fatty acids. To serve the needs of the few systems that require glucose at all times, the pancreas releases a hormone called glucagon, which orders the liver, aided by vitamin B6, to break down its stored glycogen into glucose molecules and release them into the bloodstream to maintain adequate blood glucose levels. However, since the liver can only store about 400 calories worth of glycogen, glucagon also turns on the liver's gluconeogenesis pathways, which use vitamins B6 and B7, to build brand new glucose molecules out of fat and protein. Whereas we can only store hours worth of energy as glycogen, we can store months worth of energy as fat, allowing us to energize our cells for very long periods of time between meals if necessary. Your cell's ability to switch most of their metabolic activities back and forth between glucose and fat ensures that they get their energy needs met around the clock regardless of how much carbohydrate you eat or how often. If we'd needed constant access to carbohydrates, our species wouldn't have lasted very long. Indeed, your cells expect you to spend time in a low insulin, fat-burning mode on a regular basis. Only when you are vigorously burning fat can your liver generate ketones to help energize your brain. And there are distinct advantages to this metabolic state. When you are vigorously burning fat, there will be more fatty acids entering your liver than it can use for energy. You can't store the extra fatty acids as fat because insulin is low, so your fat cells are in burning mode, not in storage mode. Your fat storage pathways are turned off. Instead, the liver takes those surplus fatty acids, which can be fairly long molecules, and breaks them down into small fragments called ketone bodies, also known as ketones, that are faster and easier to burn. By turning excess fatty acids into ketones, your liver is essentially pre-digesting them for your busiest organs, most importantly, your heart, muscles, kidneys, and brain, organs that need access to fast energy and don't have time to spend tediously chopping up long molecules. In fat-burning mode, heart and muscle cells have the luxury of choice. They can burn fatty acids, ketones, or their own supplies of stored glycogen, which they selfishly do not share with the rest of the body, for energy. In contrast, the brain can only store tiny amounts of glycogen, and its neurons can't burn fatty acids. So under lower glucose conditions, the brain becomes dependent on ketones to help meet its high energy demands. Ketone chemistry. Ketone bodies come in three forms: acetoacetate, acetone, and beta-hydroxybutyrate, or BHB. Acetoacetate is the only one cells can burn, but it isn't very stable, so it doesn't travel well. You'll find more details about ketone chemistry in your accompanying PDF. Brain metabolism. University of Sherbrooke brain metabolism expert Professor Stephen Cunnane describes the brain as a hybrid engine that ideally runs on a mixture of glucose and ketones. This dual fuel system ensures that your brain has a constant supply of energy regardless of what you eat and how often. Your brain on glucose. The brain continuously sips glucose from the bloodstream through one-way valves stationed along the blood-brain barrier. This system keeps the brain's glucose level about 80% lower than the blood glucose level. So if your blood glucose is 100 milligrams per deciliter, your brain glucose will be about 20 milligrams per deciliter. If your blood glucose is 200 milligrams per deciliter, your brain glucose will be about 40 milligrams per deciliter, and so on. So the higher your blood glucose, the higher your brain glucose. Inside the brain, hungry neurons siphon up about 85% of those incoming glucose molecules. But since they can't burn glucose very well without insulin, the blood-brain barrier is studded with insulin receptors that escort insulin into the brain. Like a foreman arriving at a job site, when insulin attaches to the surface of a neuron, it flips on a series of metabolic switches inside the neuron to fire up glucose processing. And production lines immediately begin humming with activity, burning glucose for energy and building new molecules. Your brain on ketones, plus glucose. Whenever blood glucose and insulin levels fall, blood ketone levels will rise. As they circulate through the brain, transporters along the blood-brain barrier welcome them inside. So, just as with glucose, the higher your blood ketones, the higher your brain ketones. And just as with glucose, neurons display receptors on their surfaces to capture those ketones so they can burn them for energy. However, your brain cannot run on ketones alone. We'll hear why shortly. So even when you're vigorously burning fat and your blood ketones are relatively high, your liver continues to produce glucose to support brain operations that require glucose. Unless something is terribly wrong, there is always plenty of glucose in your bloodstream. But ketones can be harder to come by. In most well-fed people who eat a typical diet, ketone levels tend to be extremely low. Because high carbohydrate diets keep insulin levels too high to allow significant ketone production to occur. Ketones typically only begin rising to meaningful levels if you're sleeping, fasting, exercising, restricting calories, or eating a ketogenic diet. Under those conditions, your body will burn more fat, and your liver will turn some of that fat into ketones. In other words, you will enter a state of ketosis. When insulin is high and ketones are low, your brain runs almost exclusively on glucose. As insulin falls and ketones rise, your brain begins burning more ketones and less glucose. Most people think of ketones as an emergency backup fuel for the brain, but given the option, the brain will continue to absorb and burn ketones even when there's plenty of glucose available. The brain's voluntary refusal to run entirely on glucose when ketones are present is intriguing and suggests there may be distinct advantages to spending time in a lower glucose, higher ketone state of mind. When insulin is low and ketones are high, your brain shifts into a different metabolic mode, a healing mode that allows it to quiet down and recover from the intensive insulin-driven operations, such as growth, building, and storage that occur when we're actively processing food. The yin and yang of healthy brain metabolism. Scientists at the National Institute on Aging and Johns Hopkins University refer to the shift from carbohydrate-based metabolism to fat-based metabolism as the glucose to ketone switch, or the G to K switch. They have documented numerous brain benefits to spending time in ketosis, whether that state is achieved through vigorous exercise, caloric restriction, intermittent fasting, or a ketogenic diet. When you flip your switch from glucose to ketones, a whole host of pathways that have been suppressed by high insulin conditions come to life, including autophagy pathways that recycle or destroy damaged cell components with the help of calcium and zinc, pathways that bolster your immune system and make you more resilient to stress, and pathways that promote neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to grow new cells and wire them together in new patterns. Creating these new circuits, which is how we learn and remember new things, requires vitamin A, vitamin D, calcium, and zinc. These duties are essential for optimal brain function, suggesting that all of us would be wise to spend some time in ketosis on a regular basis, regardless of what we choose to eat, how metabolically healthy we are, or whether or not we currently have a mental health concern. Keeping your metabolism on its toes by regularly switching up its fuel source appears to be one of the secrets of robust mental and physical health. Unfortunately, many of us have lost our metabolic flexibility. When we look closely at specific mental and physical health conditions, it will become clear why some of us need to spend most or all of our time in ketosis in order to feel and function well. Deeper dive: how the brain makes energy. To better understand healthy brain metabolism, the kinds of things that can go wrong, and how being in ketosis can help you work around some of those problems, we need to go deeper into the brain cells themselves, where energy is made. This section gets technical, but don't worry about the names of molecules or pathways. They're just there for those of you who want that degree of specificity. Some of the essential micronutrients involved in key pathways are pointed out along the way. If you just want the basics, listen to the takeaways at the end of each concept. Concept number 1. Electrons are energy. For a cell to extract energy from any molecule, it must first break open the powerful bonds between the protons, positively charged particles, and electrons, negatively charged particles, that hold their individual atoms together, because that's where the energy is stored. The electrons within glucose and ketones are in strong, stable relationships with their protons, so wrenching them free is no easy task. Free electrons are highly unstable and reactive because they are seeking to return to the safety of a strong chemical bond. Whether a cell is burning glucose or ketone molecules, the goal is the same: sever their bonds, carefully remove their electrons, capture the energy from those electrons, and store it as ATP, adenosine triphosphate molecules. Portable packets of instant energy that cells can easily tear open to power their daily activities. A single busy neuron can burn through more than 4 billion ATP molecules per second. Neurons use the majority of this ATP to power their sodium-potassium pumps, as well as to create, release, and recycle neurotransmitters. But like all cells, neurons must also tend to a multitude of more mundane duties to support building, storage, maintenance, repair, growth, defense, and reproductive operations. And all of these require ATP too. Without adequate ATP, your brain cells will not thrive. And if the energy deficit is too great, they will not survive. Takeaway number 1. To turn glucose and ketone molecules into energy, cells break them apart, remove their electrons, high-energy particles, and store the captured energy in miniature, ready-to-use power packs called ATP. Concept number 2. Cells have two engines. Neurons house two systems for generating energy. One is a simple process called glycolysis, which unceremoniously chops glucose molecules in half, quickly releasing small amounts of energy. Let's call this system Engine G. This ancient metabolic pathway has been used by single-celled organisms since the earliest days of life on Earth when oxygen was scarce. The other is a sophisticated process that completely dismantles fragments of glucose or ketone molecules, generating large amounts of energy. This advanced system requires oxygen and takes place only inside dynamic, double-membraned structures bustling around within our cells called mitochondria. We'll call this system Engine M. Mitochondria were once independent bacteria-like organisms swimming freely in Earth's primordial soup, along with other microscopic beings, including the single-celled life forms that would ultimately evolve into human beings. Then, some 1.5 billion years ago, one of these mitochondria either invaded one of our microscopic ancestors to live inside of it like a parasite, or one of our microscopic ancestors came along and swallowed one of these mitochondria whole. Either way, all of us now contain these remarkable workhorses within our cells, exploiting them for their energy-producing talent. In a win-win arrangement, we house and feed them, and they energize us. Their secret power? Embedded within the innermost membranes of mitochondria are countless electron transport chains, marvels of biological engineering that thread electrons through a series of 5 special protein complexes to harness energy from electrons and churn it into ATP. Engine M is so powerful that it extracts about 15 times more energy from glucose than Engine G can. Our neurons are so dependent on mitochondria for energy that a single neuron may harbor as many as 2 million of them. Without these hives of electrical activity, we wouldn't be able to produce enough energy to support our complex multicellular selves, because Engine G alone simply isn't powerful enough. Burning glucose using Engine G is akin to tossing newspaper on a campfire to produce a brief flash of light and heat, whereas burning glucose or ketones inside mitochondria using Engine M is akin to placing a heavy log into an efficient wood furnace and enjoying the light and warmth for hours. Takeaway number 2. Cells contain 2 engines for making ATP, a simple engine that chops glucose in half to make small amounts of ATP. We'll call this Engine G because it can only process glucose, and a sophisticated engine that uses oxygen to turn glucose, ketones, and other fuel sources into large amounts of ATP. We'll call this Engine M because it is located inside mitochondria, tiny bacteria-like structures living inside our cells. Engine M gathers electrons from glucose and ketones and then threads them through a series of 5 special protein complexes called the electron transport chain to churn them into ATP. Concept number 3. Optimal glucose processing requires both engines. To reap the maximum amount of energy from glucose, the neuron must first run glucose through engine G outside the mitochondria, then finish breaking it down inside the mitochondria using engine M. As glucose gets broken into smaller and smaller pieces, more of its electrons are removed. Outside the mitochondria, with the help of vitamins B1 and B3, engine G splits glucose in half, creating 2 molecules of pyruvate. Pyruvate travels deep into the heart of mitochondria, where vitamins B1, B2, B3, and B5 help break it down into a smaller molecule called acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is the right size to enter the citric acid cycle, a rotary of chemical reactions that uses magnesium, iron, and vitamins B1, B2, B3, B5, and B7 to finish completely dismantling it. Finally, courier molecules gather up stripped electrons from all of the previous steps and escort them to the electron transport chain, which uses vitamin B3, magnesium, iron, sulfur, copper, and oxygen to extract the energy from those electrons and turn it into ATP. Takeaway number 3. Engine M can't burn glucose unless engine G chops it in half first. To extract the maximum amount of energy from glucose, cells need both engines, engine G to split glucose into 2 pieces, and engine M to completely dismantle those pieces. You'll find an illustration of the brain's energy production system in the accompanying PDF. Concept number 4. Glucose and ketones burn differently. Unlike engine G, which can only process glucose, the electron transport chain that drives engine M is an equal opportunity furnace, so it will accept electrons from glucose or ketones. Just like glucose, ketones must be broken down into acetyl-CoA and spun through the citric acid cycle to generate electrons to funnel into the electron transport chain. However, there are key differences between how glucose and ketones are processed that help explain how ketosis helps your brain function better if your brain has trouble burning glucose for energy, which can be the case if you have insulin resistance or certain psychiatric conditions. 1. Ketones burn more quickly and easily because they don't have to go through engine G first. It takes 13 chemical reactions to turn glucose into acetyl-CoA. Ketones are a more efficient energy source than glucose because it only takes 3 completely different chemical reactions to convert the ketone beta-hydroxybutyrate into acetyl-CoA. Why does this matter? If any of the steps involved in the long pathway that turns glucose into acetyl-CoA is malfunctioning, which may be the case in bipolar disorder, for example, see Chapter 9, you can still make plenty of acetyl-CoA out of ketones because ketone processing completely bypasses all 13 of those steps. 2. Ketones burn differently because more of their electrons take a shortcut. As electrons are removed from glucose and ketones, they're handed off to one of 2 courier molecules to be carried to the electron transport chain. NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, made from vitamin B3, which passes its electrons to the first protein complex in the electron transport chain, called complex 1, and FAD, flavin adenine dinucleotide, made from vitamin B2, which passes its electrons to complex 2, a little further down the chain. Engine G uses NAD as its courier more often, which means that engine G traffics more electrons through complex 1. Why does this matter? If complex 1 is malfunctioning, which can occur in certain psychiatric conditions such as autism, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, then being in ketosis will partially bypass that defect because electrons that come from ketones don't travel through complex 1 as often. 3. Burning ketones requires less insulin. Ketones also come in handy if your brain is short on insulin, or if your brain cells have trouble using insulin properly, scenarios that can occur in people with insulin resistance. Under low insulin conditions, engine G slows down, but ketones only use engine M, and ketones burn beautifully in a low insulin environment. Takeaway number 4. Ketones and glucose burn differently. 1. Ketones burn more quickly and easily because they completely bypass engine G. Also, if engine G is malfunctioning for any reason, which will make it harder to burn glucose for energy, you can still burn ketones using engine M. 2. More of the electrons from ketones take a shortcut into the electron transport chain. Electrons can enter the chain via complex 1 or complex 2. Electrons from ketones use complex 2 more often. So if there's a problem with complex 1, ketones help you partially bypass that problem. 3. Ketone processing requires less insulin. If brain insulin is low or isn't working properly, which can happen if you have insulin resistance, ketones will still burn well. In fact, they burn best under low insulin conditions. Concept number 5. 2 engines are better than 1. Ketones have some advantages over glucose, but the brain can't survive on ketones alone. Optimal brain metabolism requires that both engine G and engine M be fully operational. Engine G is useful in situations that require fast energy, in crowded areas inside cells where there's less room for mitochondria, and when blood oxygen supply to the brain has been disrupted by inflammation, tumor, or stroke, for example. Engine G is also the only entry point for the pentose phosphate pathway, which, with the help of vitamins B1 and B2, turns glucose molecules into DNA, RNA, and antioxidants. Yes, our cells make their own antioxidants. In fact, cells can't use glucose for anything without running it through engine G first. However, engine G alone isn't powerful enough to generate enough energy to support cell metabolism, and it can't process ketones at all. It can only process glucose. Engine M efficiently produces large quantities of energy from a wide variety of molecules, including glucose and ketones, but it is slower, ill-suited to cramped quarters where there's less room for mitochondria, and performs poorly in low oxygen environments. Engine M is also vulnerable to damage by the very oxygen molecules it relies on to generate ATP. Takeaway number 5. Engine G and engine M are complementary. Each has its advantages and disadvantages, so the cell functions best and produces the maximum amount of energy when both engines are fully operational. Concept number 6. The oxygen conundrum. As high-energy electrons from glucose and ketones make their way through the electron transport chain, they gradually give up bits of energy, which complex 5 turns into ATP. Waiting at the end of the electron transport chain are oxygen molecules which have been cut in half. This allows them to bond with the used electrons and form stable molecules of water. Oxygen's special ability to safely absorb these leftover electrons is the single most important reason why we need to breathe. Without oxygen, electron transport chains grind quickly to a halt and cells perish. Oxygen's love for electrons is a blessing and a curse. When you burn molecules in the presence of oxygen, you're playing with fire, because oxygen molecules love to steal electrons. Whenever rogue electrons prematurely escape the electron transport chain, which they do with some regularity because they are difficult to control, they can react with whole oxygen molecules and create highly unstable oxygen-free radicals. Left to their own devices, free radicals can run amok and damage the cell, a phenomenon called oxidative stress. Some degree of oxidative stress is normal and healthy. Mitochondria expect to see a certain amount of oxidative stress, and they're equipped with their own internal antioxidants to cope with it. So the system has evolved to strike a healthy balance between oxidation and antioxidation. However, if anything interferes with the ability to neutralize free radicals in a timely fashion, or if mitochondria become overwhelmed with too many free radicals at once, the resulting excessive oxidative stress can injure mitochondria and jeopardize their ability to produce energy. Another important difference between ketones and glucose is that burning ketones results in less oxidative stress. Takeaway number 6. Engine M uses oxygen, which is risky because oxygen can react with electrons to form unstable substances called free radicals that can cause damaging oxidative stress to the cell if your cell's own internal antioxidants aren't quickly able to neutralize them. Burning ketones results in less oxidative stress than burning glucose. In short, optimal mental health requires that both engine G and engine M are in good working order. If you feed them the fuel molecules and micronutrients they need, and you protect them from inflammation and oxidative stress, they will serve you well. Nutrition from the inside out. The point of exploring the microscopic world of human metabolism isn't to memorize the names of pathways and molecules, but rather to marvel at and be humbled by its wisdom and complexity. This infinitely intricate system evolved over millions of years to magically transform whole plant and animal foods into the macronutrients and micronutrients that your brain and the rest of your body need to function at their best, without any help from medications, supplements, nutrition studies, or dietary guidelines. As complicated as the science of brain metabolism may appear, it reveals some simple truths about macronutrients, micronutrients, and meal timing that must be respected if we are to achieve optimal mental health. It bears repeating that the brain requires all essential micronutrients, with those most directly involved in energy production pathways being iron, magnesium, copper, and vitamins B1, B2, B3, B5, and B7. Thyroid hormone, which contains iodine, is also involved. The brain is a hybrid engine that requires some glucose at all times, but that glucose does not need to come from dietary carbohydrate. The brain can't use glucose properly without adequate insulin. The brain needs to spend some time in ketosis on a regular basis. Now that we understand the nutritional and metabolic foundations of robust mental health, the next task before us is to understand the nutritional and metabolic root causes of poor mental health. In other words, what kinds of things can go wrong inside your brain if you don't feed it properly?